The crimson dawn of June 4th, 1942, broke over the vast Pacific Ocean with an ominous stillness that belied the catastrophic events about to unfold. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed across the seemingly endless expanse of water. He, brilliant strategist, who had orchestrated the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, now faced his greatest gamble and audacious plan to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would crush their naval power once and for all. The Japanese combined fleet stretched across the Pacific in a massive formation that represented the pinnacle of naval might. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the spearhead of this armada, their flight decks bristling with over 270 of the finest aircraft in the Imperial Navy. These floating fortresses had been the instruments of Japan's stunning victories across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies, establishing an empire that stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. Yamamoto's plan was elegant in its complexity and devastating in its intended execution. By threatening the American naval base at Midway Atoll, he would force Admiral Chester Nimitz to commit his remaining carrier forces to defend this strategic outpost. The Japanese would then spring their trap, using their superior numbers and tactical position to annihilate the American fleet in a single, decisive engagement. Victory would secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific for decades to come, potentially forcing the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. The morning air hummed with the drone of aircraft engines as the Japanese carriers prepared their first strike. On the flight deck of Akagi, Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the same pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, supervised the arming of his bombers. The crimson rising sun emblazoned on their wings seemed to pulse with the confidence of an empire at its zenith. These pilots, veterans of countless victories, possessed a skill and determination that had made them the most feared naval aviators in the world. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force from aboard Akagi, felt the weight of expectation pressing upon his shoulders. His four carriers had been the sword of Japanese expansion, cutting through enemy defenses with surgical precision. Today, they would write the final chapter of American resistance in the Pacific. The meteorological reports promised clear skies and calm seas, perfect conditions for the decisive battle that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific theater. Reference: this account draws from historical records documented in Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, providing detailed analysis of Japanese tactical planning and fleet composition during the Battle of Midway. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the carrier decks, the Japanese naval aviators completed their final preparations. The fate of nations hung in the balance, suspended between the ambitions of empire and the desperate determination of a democracy fighting for its survival. In a few hours, the Pacific would witness one of the most pivotal naval battles in human history, a confrontation that would determine not just the outcome of a war, but the very future of the modern world. 2,000 miles to the northeast, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in the Combat Information Center at Pearl Harbor, his calm demeanor masking the enormous pressure weighing upon his decisions. The smoking ruins of Battleship Row still serve as a grim reminder of Japanese capabilities. Yet Nimitz possessed something his adversary did not expect: knowledge of enemy intentions. Through the miraculous work of American codebreakers, Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptographic unit housed in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, had achieved what many thought impossible. Commander Joseph Rockford and his team of dedicated cryptanalysts had penetrated the Japanese naval code designated JN-25, providing unprecedented insight into Yamamoto's operational plans. The intelligence revealed that the Japanese intended to strike Midway Atoll on June 4th, using the attack as bait to draw out and destroy the American Pacific Fleet. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Nimitz made a decision that defied conventional military wisdom. Rather than await the Japanese attack from a defensive position, he would position his available carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway, hoping to catch the enemy by surprise. It was a desperate gamble, with the entire Pacific theater hanging in the balance. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise, had departed Pearl Harbor on May 28th. The stern, methodical Spruance was an unusual choice to command carriers, being a cruiser and destroyer specialist, but his analytical mind and steady temperament made him ideal for the complex tactical situation ahead. Alongside him, Captain Mark Mitchell commanded Hornet, while the battle-scarred Yorktown, under Captain Elliot Buckmaster, limped toward the rendezvous point despite damage from the Battle of the Coral Sea. The American force was pitifully small compared to the Japanese armada bearing down on Midway. 3 carriers against 4, with less than 230 aircraft total, facing an enemy force nearly twice their size. Many of the American pilots were inexperienced, having received minimal training before being thrust into combat. The torpedo bombers flew obsolete Devastator aircraft that were slow, vulnerable, and equipped with defective torpedoes that often failed to explode. Reference: intelligence breakthrough details are documented in And I Was There by Rear Admiral Edwin Layton, providing first-hand accounts of the code-breaking efforts that enabled American victory. Yet the Americans possessed advantages beyond mere intelligence. Their damage control procedures were superior. Their pilots were trained in flexible tactical doctrines, and their industrial capacity promised reinforcements that Japan could never match. Most importantly, they fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, knowing that defeat would leave the American West Coast vulnerable to invasion. As dawn broke on June 4th, the American carriers maintained strict radio silence while positioning themselves for what Admiral Nimitz would later call the most crucial naval battle in American history. The fate of democracy in the Pacific rested with these 3 ships and their brave crews, sailing toward an encounter that would test every assumption about naval warfare and determine the trajectory of the Second World War. The first thunderclap of battle erupted at 6:24 a.m. when a Catalina flying boat spotted the Japanese carrier force approaching from the northwest. Lieutenant Howard Aidey's comm radio transmission: enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, sent electric shocks through both American task forces as they prepared for the decisive engagement. Vice Admiral Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway at 4:30 a.m., sending 108 aircraft screaming toward the tiny atoll. The formation of Nakajima Cape bombers, Aichi Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters represented the finest naval aviation force in the world. Their pilots veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies. As they disappeared into the morning haze, Nagumo retained a second wave of aircraft on his carrier decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for the expected American naval response. On Midway itself, Marine Fighter Squadron 121 scrambled to intercept the incoming raid. With their outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters, Major Floyd Parks and his pilots knew they flew inferior aircraft against superior opponents. Yet they climbed toward the enemy formation with grim determination. The ensuing air battle was a massacre. The nimble Zeros cut through the American fighters like scythes through wheat, shooting down 15 of 27 defending aircraft while losing only 2 of their own. The Japanese bombing of Midway commenced at 6:20 a.m. with devastating precision. Hangars exploded in sheets of flame, fuel dumps erupted in towering infernos, and the powerhouse disappeared beneath a cloud of smoke and debris. Yet the airfield remained operational, and the surviving American aircraft continued launching desperate counterattacks against the Japanese fleet. Marine Captain Richard Fleming led 6 Vindicator dive bombers in a suicidal assault that achieved no hits but demonstrated the fierce determination of Midway's defenders. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the Japanese strike, radioed back to Admiral Nagumo at 7 a.m. with a message that would prove fatally consequential. There's need for a second attack. The airfield facilities had been damaged but not destroyed, and American aircraft continued operating from the battered runways. Nagumo faced a crucial decision. Should he immediately launch his reserve aircraft armed for naval combat, or rearm them with land attack weapons for another strike against Midway? Reference: detailed chronology of the morning's events is preserved in official U.S. Navy battle reports, archived in the Battle of Midway, official Navy Department communiques, providing precise timelines of the unfolding engagement. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made the decision that would cost Japan the battle. He ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second strike against Midway, believing he had time to neutralize the base before dealing with any American naval forces. On the hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with land attack weapons. Ammunition and fuel lines snaked across the carrier decks as the Japanese prepared for what they assumed would be their final, decisive blow against American resistance. Unknown to the Japanese, American scout planes had already spotted their positions, and 3 carrier task forces were racing toward launch positions. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history, as the hunters suddenly found themselves becoming the hunted. in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. At 7 a.m., as Japanese ordnance crews frantically rearmed their aircraft, Admiral Spruance made the crucial decision that would determine the battle's outcome. Despite being 90 miles farther from the enemy than optimal launch range, he ordered an immediate all-out strike, launched the attack, rang across the flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet as air crews scrambled to ready every available aircraft for the most important mission. In American naval history, the American strike force that thundered off the carrier decks represented a desperate gamble. With inferior equipment and hastily trained crews, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, climbed into their obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers, knowing they faced almost certain death. These lumbering aircraft, designed in the early 1930s, could barely reach 115 miles per hour, while carrying their Mark 13 torpedoes' defective weapons that frequently failed to explode even when they found their targets. Waldron, a part Cherokee warrior from South Dakota, had studied Japanese tactics obsessively and possessed an intuitive understanding of enemy movements that bordered on the mystical. As his 15 Devastators formed up and headed southwest, he broke radio silence to address his squadron. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. His words proved prophetic. Within 2 hours, he and 14 of his men would be dead, victims of Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The American attack developed piecemeal due to navigation errors and communication failures. Fighter escorts became separated from bomber formations, leaving the vulnerable torpedo planes to face the Japanese alone. At 9:20 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 8 found the enemy carriers and began their attack runs through a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters. The Devastators approached at wave top level, their crews maintaining perfect formation even as aircraft exploded around them in balls of flame. Lieutenant George Gay's Devastator was the last to be shot down, crashing into the Pacific just 500 yards from the carrier Kaga. Gay survived the crash and spent the next 30 hours floating in the ocean, witnessing the entire battle from his unique vantage point in the water. He watched in horror as every one of his squadron mates died, their aircraft burning and sinking beneath the waves, without scoring a single hit on the Japanese fleet. Reference: Lieutenant George Gay's first-hand account is preserved in Sole Survivor, providing unique witness testimony of the torpedo bomber attacks and their devastating casualties. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown met similar fates, their Devastators falling like autumn leaves before the concentrated fury of Japanese defenses. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers, only 6 returned to their ships, and not one torpedo found its mark. The sacrifice seemed meaningless, a tragic waste of brave men and precious aircraft that America could ill afford to lose. Yet the torpedo bomber attacks, though tactically unsuccessful, achieved a strategic miracle. The low-level assaults forced Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. More crucially, the attacks disrupted Japanese operations precisely when Admiral Nagumo needed to launch his own strike. Carrier decks cluttered with rearming aircraft, fuel lines stretched across hangar spaces, and ordnance scattered everywhere created a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark was about to descend from 30,000 feet in the form of American dive bombers, whose arrival would transform catastrophic defeat into stunning victory in a matter of minutes. At 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed. Commander Clarence McCluskey, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels, made a split-second decision that would alter the course of world history. Instead of returning to his carrier, he followed the destroyer's wake, correctly deducing that it was racing to rejoin the main Japanese fleet. 2 minutes later, McCluskey's 37 Dauntless dive bombers crested a cloud layer at 14,000 feet and beheld a sight that would be burned into their memories forever. Spread beneath them like toys on a blue carpet were the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. The carriers were caught in their most vulnerable configuration, rearming and refueling aircraft, while maneuvering to avoid the persistent torpedo bomber attacks. Target in sight, McCluskey radioed as he rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the carrier Kaga. Behind him, his pilots selected their targets with deadly precision. The months of intensive dive bombing training in the clear skies over California were about to pay dividends in the most crucial 5 minutes of the Pacific War. As the American aircraft screamed earthward, their engines howling and airframes straining under enormous G-forces, Japanese lookouts finally spotted the incoming threat. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6, led his section in a devastating attack on Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. His 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the carrier's flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, igniting aircraft fuel and ammunition in a chain reaction of explosions that would doom the ship. On Kaga, McCluskey's bomb and those of his wingmen triggered similar catastrophic fires, turning the carrier into a floating inferno within minutes. Simultaneously, Bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, struck the carrier Soryu with equal precision. 3 direct hits transformed the ship into a blazing wreck, her aircraft and aviation fuel feeding fires that would burn for hours. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's fleet carriers had been mortally wounded, their offensive capability destroyed by a handful of American dive bombers. Reference: the precise timing and execution of the dive bomber attacks are documented in official U.S. Navy action reports, compiled in Battle Report, The Attack on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands by Commander Walter Carrick. The transformation was so sudden and complete that Japanese officers could barely comprehend what had occurred. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi, watched in stunned disbelief as his magnificent carrier force dissolved into smoking ruins. The same ships that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, the instruments of Pearl Harbor and countless other victories, were dying beneath clouds of black smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. Only Hiryu remained operational, her aircraft already launching a desperate counterattack against the American carriers. Captain Tomio Kaku, commanding the sole surviving Japanese carrier, knew that his ship represented Japan's last hope for salvaging victory from the jaws of catastrophic defeat. The battle was far from over, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically in those crucial 5 minutes when American dive bombers turned the tide of the Pacific War with deadly precision and incredible courage. The rising sun that had illuminated Japanese expansion across the Pacific was setting rapidly on this June afternoon, its crimson light reflecting off the burning hulks of what had once been the most powerful carrier force in the world. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge, surrounded by smoke and chaos, yet determined to extract vengeance from the catastrophic morning. His carrier, the sole survivor of Nagumo's once mighty force, represented Japan's final hope for salvaging something from the disaster. At 10:58 a.m., he launched 18 Aichi Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, their mission to find and destroy the American carriers that had delivered such devastating punishment. And the Japanese counterattack found its target at 12:10 p.m., when Kobayashi's bombers spotted Yorktown steaming northeast with her escorts. The veteran carrier, still bearing scars from the Coral Sea engagement, presented an inviting target as she recovered her returning aircraft. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire and desperate defensive maneuvers, 3 Japanese bombs found their mark, penetrating Yorktown's flight deck and igniting fires in her forward elevator and signal bridge. Admiral Frank Fletcher, his flagship crippled and burning, transferred operational command to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise. The decision reflected the harsh realities of carrier warfare. Damaged ships became liabilities that diverted precious escorts and threatened entire task forces. As damage control parties fought to save Yorktown, Spruance faced the crucial decision of whether to pursue the retreating Japanese or consolidate his remaining forces. At 2:45 p.m., Hiryu launched her final strike 10K torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had recommended a second strike on Midway that morning. This final gambit represented the last offensive capability remaining to the Japanese fleet, a desperate attempt to even the score before Hiryu herself fell victim to American vengeance. Tomonaga's aircraft found Yorktown again at 3:20 p.m., despite her crew's Herculean efforts to restore power and resume operations. The torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing a 26-degree list that threatened to capsize the ship. Captain Elliot Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandoned ship. As Yorktown settled deeper into the Pacific swells, her battle ensign still flying defiantly from the mainmast. Reference: Yorktown's damage and abandonment procedures are detailed in the ship's war diary, archived in Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, providing technical specifications of the carrier's final actions. Admiral Spruance, now commanding the American forces, launched his own final strike at 3:30 p.m. 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, climbed toward Hiryu's position with grim determination. The Japanese carrier, isolated and vulnerable without fighter cover, presented a perfect target as she attempted to launch additional aircraft. The carrier erupted in flames identical to those that had consumed her sister ships. Throughout the day, Captain Kaku, refusing to abandon his command, went down with his ship when she finally sank at 9 a.m. the following morning. As darkness fell on June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was littered with the burning hulks of Japanese carriers that had once seemed invincible, for fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air crews lay beneath the waves. Along with the dreams of Japanese expansion across the Pacific, the Battle of Midway had concluded with one of the most complete and decisive naval victories in military history, achieved by American courage, intelligence, and the slim margin that separates triumph from catastrophe in warfare. The crimson dawn of June 5, 1942, rose over a Pacific Ocean transformed by 24 hours of unprecedented naval combat, where Admiral Yamamoto's mighty combined fleet had once steamed with confident purpose. Only scattered task forces now fled westward, their dreams of decisive victory replaced by the bitter reality of catastrophic defeat. The smoking wrecks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lay on the ocean floor, taking with them not merely ships and aircraft, but the offensive capability that had made Japan master of the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports aboard his flagship Yamato, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his forces. The loss of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu represented more than the destruction of ships. These carriers had been the spearhead of Japanese expansion, the instruments of Pearl Harbor, and the symbol of Imperial Navy supremacy. The strategic implications rippled outward like shock waves across the Pacific theater. Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations had been crippled in a single day, forcing a shift from expansion to desperate defense of an overextended empire. The planned invasion of Midway was canceled, the assault on New Caledonia postponed indefinitely, and the dream of forcing America to negotiate a favorable peace evaporated like morning mist under the harsh sun of reality. For Admiral Nimitz and the American Pacific Fleet, Midway represented vindication of the intelligence services, validation of aggressive tactical doctrine, and proof that American industrial might and fighting spirit could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The victory restored American morale after 6 months of unrelenting defeats, and provided the foundation for the island-hopping campaign that would eventually carry American forces to Tokyo Bay. Lieutenant George Gay, rescued after 30 hours floating in his life jacket, became living testimony to the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and the other torpedo bomber crews, whose courage had created the conditions for victory. His survival story, told and retold across America, embodied the determination that would sustain the nation through 3 more years of brutal warfare. Reference: Strategic Analysis of Midway's Long-Term Consequences appears in Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, providing authoritative assessment of the battle's impact on Pacific theater operations. The abandoned hulk of Yorktown, listing heavily but still afloat, would provide one final drama when Japanese submarine I-168 torpedoed both the carrier and destroyer Hammond on June 6, sending both ships to the bottom. Even in death, Yorktown had absorbed punishment meant for other vessels. Her final sacrifice symbolic of the carrier warfare that had revolutionized naval combat. As the surviving Japanese forces limped back toward their bases, they carried with them the knowledge that June 4, 1942, had marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The tide of war had turned at Midway, where a few hundred American aviators had changed the course of world history through skill, courage, and sacrifice that would echo through generations. The rising sun that had illuminated Japanese conquests from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean now set permanently on dreams of Pacific Empire, replaced by the steady advance of American forces that would not stop until they reached the shores of Japan itself. Midway had proven that in warfare, as in life, fortune favors not the strong alone, but those who combine strength with wisdom, courage with intelligence, and determination with the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory.